The Ashcombe assembly rooms had never been so full, and Judith Wren had never been so aware of her own hands. She stood at the end of the receiving line in a gown that was not hers, sea green silk let out at the seams by Mrs. Pruitt's careful needle, and she watched the company arrange itself into the particular hush that came before a name was called. Candlelight lay thick along the ballroom's gilt cornices. A quartet tuned itself in the gallery above. Somewhere ahead of her, a girl in rose pink laughed at something not especially funny. The laugh pitched to be heard by the gentleman near the fireplace. And Judith understood, the way she understood most things about this room, that she was standing inside a language she had never been taught to speak. Her father had taught her Latin conjugations and the proper form of a letter to a bishop. He had never taught her how to fold her body correctly in front of strangers who had already decided what she was. The steward called her name. She stepped forward. She had watched Selina Ashdown perform the deep, unhurried curtsy not 10 minutes before, a slow descent and rise that seemed to take a year and asked nothing of anyone watching but admiration, and Judith had told herself she needed only to copy it. Her body, when the moment came, remembered instead the quick bob she had given the baker's wife every morning of her working life, knees dipping fast and low, chin ducking, a gesture built for narrow doorways and short errands, not for a room of 200 candles and Lady Constance Ashdown's pale, assessing eyes. The room noticed. A room like that, always noticed. It was not a loud sound the company made. It was smaller than that, a soft collective intake of breath. A ripple of glances passed hand to hand, like a card no one wanted to be caught holding. Judith felt the heat come up her throat and did not look at any single face, because she did not need to. She had felt this particular silence before, on the church steps of this same town, 7 years old, and holding out a chipped bowl, while women in good bonnets crossed the street to avoid her father's outstretched hand. Only one face in the room did not seem to be enjoying itself. He stood near the terrace doors, tall in a coat the color of a night sky just past sunset, and he had not laughed. Judith would remember that later, turning it over the way one turns over a coin found in the road, uncertain of its value. He had simply gone still, the particular stillness of a man listening to something he had not expected to hear. And for one unbearable second, his eyes found hers across the ballroom floor and did not immediately look away. She did not yet know his name was Simeon Hale, Earl of Camden, or that he had buried a sister in a pauper's grave 4 years before this night, for reasons the whole room believed they understood and did not understand at all. She knew only that she had curtsied wrong, that the room had already sorted her, and that behind her, low enough to be deniable and clear enough to be heard, a voice she would come to know as Selina Ashdown's said to her companion, not quite bothering to lower it past the nearest ears, that one could always tell. Whatever finery a person borrowed, blood and bearing could not be borrowed, and the beggar's daughter had proven it in one clumsy bob before the whole of Ashcombe. If you have ever walked into a room and felt every eye reorganize you into something smaller than you knew yourself to be, you will understand what came next. And I promise you it does not end where it begins. Judith did not run. She had learned, over 2 winters of genteel starvation dressed up as respectability, that running only confirmed what a room already believed. She lifted her chin instead, the smallest possible defiance, and walked to the edge of the room where the chaperone sat. And she did not look again toward the terrace doors, though she felt, for the rest of that evening, as though someone there was still looking at her. 6 months earlier, Judith Wren had been mending a torn glove, her mother's small silver thimble worn thin at the crown and fitted to her own finger, by the light of a single tallow candle when the last of her father's strength went out of him like a snuffed flame, and she had understood, holding his hand in the cold front room of the 2 rooms they rented above the chandler's shop, that she was now entirely alone in the world. The Reverend Josiah Wren had once held a comfortable living in the parish of Netherfold, a stone rectory with roses at the door, and a study lined with books he had read to his daughter before she could properly hold a spoon. He had lost it when his cousin, Edmund Wren, produced a set of forged accounts that named the Reverend a debtor to the estate that funded his living, a debt the family had no means to dispute, and no lawyer willing to take on credit. Within a year, the rectory was let to another clergyman. Within 2, he had sold his books, then his wife's few pieces of jewelry, then the good clock from the mantel, and had walked with his young daughter to Ashcombe because a distant cousin of his late wife's kept a boarding house there, and had once, in a kinder decade, offered to help. The cousin had died before they arrived. There had been, for a period Judith did not like to remember in detail, no work her father's pride would allow him to seek, and no work available to a broken clergyman regardless of pride, and there had been mornings on the church steps with an empty bowl, because a man could not watch his daughter go hungry a 3rd day running and call it dignity to refuse the coins of strangers. Mrs. Pruitt, the vicar's wife, had found them there on one such morning, 7-year-old Judith clutching her father's coat sleeve, and had done what dignity alone could not. She had found the Reverend a position keeping accounts for a local solicitor, modest and steady, and had taken it upon herself, in the quiet, unofficial way of women who ran half a parish without credit for it, to see that the Wrens never again wanted for bread. Judith had grown up learning her letters at Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen table and her needlework at the haberdasher's counter, half genteel and half servant, belonging fully to neither world and grateful in the particular exhausted way of the permanently careful, for whatever kindness came unasked. Her father had died, still calling her his good girl, his clever girl, and had left her nothing but his watch, cracked across the face where it had once been dropped on the church steps and never properly mended, and a single piece of advice, delivered so often in his final months that she had it by heart. He had told her that a room might decide what she was in a single glance, and that a room was very often wrong, and that the only thing worth guarding, when everything else had been taken, was the plain, unglamorous truth of her own conduct. It was Mrs. Pruitt who had insisted, when the invitation to the autumn assembly arrived by way of a kindly overlooked custom that opened certain evenings to the parish's respectable poor, that Judith attend. A companion's position had come open in a good house 2 counties distant, Mrs. Pruitt said, and a girl seen once in decent company, however briefly, stood a better chance of the reference than a girl no one had seen at all. Judith had gone because refusing Mrs. Pruitt was not a thing she knew how to do, and because some small, unkillable part of her, the part that still remembered her father's study and the roses at the rectory door, had wanted, only once, to stand inside a lit room and not be immediately swept out of it. She had not expected to be swept out of it more thoroughly for having tried. The morning after the assembly, Judith walked to the haberdasher's shop as she did every morning, her basket over her arm, and found the whole of Ashcombe's High Street already rearranged around her failure. Mrs. Fenwick at the milliner's did not quite meet her eye. 2 young women she recognized from the ballroom crossed the street with the particular unhurried care of people who wish to be seen not associating with someone. Judith kept her chin level, and her pace even, because a room, her father had told her, was very often wrong, and she intended to prove it by the ordinary evidence of showing up and doing good work. She was 3 streets from the shop when she heard the commotion outside the baker's, a boy's voice raised thin and frightened, and turned without deciding to. A woman had a small boy by the collar, the baker's youngest apprentice by the look of his flour-dusted apron, and was shaking him hard enough to rattle his teeth, accusing him in a voice pitched for an audience of having stolen a meat pie from her basket. The boy was perhaps 8 years old and weeping, insisting he had taken nothing. And the small crowd gathering did what crowds gathering around another person's trouble generally did, which was to watch and murmur and do nothing at all. Judith did not decide to intervene, so much as discover that she already had. She set down her basket, crossed the space between them, and said in a voice she kept deliberately level, because she had learned that a raised voice only fed a scene like this, that she had watched the boy from her window not a quarter hour before, sweeping the bakery step, and that if the woman's pie had gone missing, it had not gone missing into that child's pocket. It was not entirely true. Judith had not, in fact, been watching from any window. She had watched this particular boy sweep that particular step most mornings for a year, and she knew, with the plain certainty of long observation, exactly what kind of boy he was, and she was prepared to stand behind that certainty in front of the whole of Ashcombe if it meant a hungry child was not accused of a theft he had not committed. The woman, uncertain now that her audience had acquired a second voice, released the boy's collar and stalked off with her basket, muttering. The boy stared up at Judith with the dazed gratitude of the very young, wiped his nose on his sleeve, and fled back into the bakery without a word of thanks, as children so rarely think to give one. Judith did not know, retrieving her basket from the pavement, that a man on horseback had reined in at the corner of the street some moments before, and had not yet ridden on. Simeon Hale had been on his way to call upon his aunt when the small scene outside the baker's stopped him, and he had watched the whole of it from horseback with an attention he would have been hard-pressed to explain to anyone who asked. It was not simply that the young woman in the plain gray pelisse had intervened where a street full of adults had not. It was the particular quality of her intervention, level and unhysterical, offered without any apparent thought to what it might cost her to be seen defending a beggar's boy in a public street, the morning after her own public humiliation. He recognized her a moment later as the girl who had curtsied wrong. He did not ride on immediately. He told himself, dismounting to walk his horse the remaining distance to his aunt's house, that he had simply been arrested by an ordinary act of decency, the kind any gentleman might pause to note. He did not examine too closely why the sight of her plain gray back retreating up the street had left him, for the length of 2 full streets afterward, unable to properly attend to what his aunt was saying to him over tea. He had learned, 4 years before, exactly what it cost a family to look away from someone the world had decided was beneath its notice. He had not intended, riding into Ashcombe that autumn, to learn the lesson twice. Lady Ashdown received her nephew in the yellow drawing-room with the particular warmth she reserved for occasions on which she wanted something, and came to the point with the directness of a woman who considered subtlety an indulgence for people with time to waste. Selina, she said, was a sensible girl, well-connected, possessed of £8,000 and a face that turned heads from London to Bath, and it was high time Camden stopped mourning a decision that had not, in the end, been his to make, and started attending to the living. Camden did not ask which decision she meant. They both knew. His sister Anne had been 3 years his junior, and by every account that survived her, the gentlest of the Hale children, which was perhaps why she had been the one to fall in love with a curate's son their father considered beneath the family's notice. Their father had given her a choice, the curate's son or the family, and Anne, 20 years old and certain the world bent for love, had chosen the curate's son and been cut off without a farthing or a farewell. Camden had been abroad with his regiment when it happened, and had returned 2 years later to learn that the curate's son had died of a fever, that Anne had tried and failed to support herself and her infant daughter through needlework, and that she had died in a London parish workhouse the previous winter, listed in the register under a name the clerk had misheard and never corrected. Camden had gone to that workhouse himself, once the news reached him, and had stood in a cold stone corridor being told by a clerk with ink-stained fingers that the parish did not, as a rule, keep long records of paupers, and that the infant daughter had likely been sent to the Foundling Hospital, though which one the clerk could not with certainty say. He had spent 2 years and a considerable fortune searching for that child, and had found nothing but silence and old paper. He had come to understand, in the searching, exactly how easily a family's carelessness could erase a person from the world, how a whole society could decide a woman did not matter, and then simply, efficiently, act as though she never had. He had promised himself, standing in that workhouse corridor, that he would never again be the kind of man who let a room's verdict on a person's worth stand unexamined. He told his aunt none of this. He told her only, setting down his teacup with more care than the gesture strictly required, that he had not come to Ashcombe to be matched, and that Miss Ashdown's £8,000 were a recommendation he was perfectly capable of weighing for himself without his aunt's assistance. Lady Ashdown, who had not survived 4 decades at the upper edges of society by accepting a first refusal as final, smiled and changed the subject, and privately resolved to be patient. Patience, in her considerable experience, generally won. It was Mrs. Pruitt who arranged a fortnight later for Judith to deliver a parcel of mended linens to the house Lady Ashdown had taken for the season at the edge of the town, a task ordinarily beneath a solicitor's clerk's daughter, but one Judith performed without complaint, since the extra coin went directly toward the coal that would see her through the coming winter. She had not expected to encounter anyone of consequence at a tradesman's entrance, and so she was entirely unprepared, rounding the corner of the garden path with her arms full of linen, to find the Earl of Camden standing beneath the bare branches of an apple tree, apparently waiting for nothing in particular. He asked without preamble whether the boy outside the baker's had come to any harm. Judith, startled into honesty, said that he had not, that he swept the step most mornings and would likely go on doing so undisturbed, and that she was surprised his lordship had noticed the incident at all, let alone remembered it. Camden said that he made a habit of noticing what most rooms preferred to overlook. It was, he added, a habit that had served him poorly in company, and rather better in judging character. There was a silence after that which Judith did not know how to fill, so she did not attempt to fill it, and found to her surprise that he did not seem to require her to. He asked instead whether her arms were not tired, and when she admitted they were, he took the parcel of linens from her without further discussion, an act so far outside the ordinary conduct of an earl toward a solicitor's clerk's daughter that Judith stood for a moment simply staring at her own empty arms. "Sit down," he said, nodding toward the low garden wall, "before you drop something else." It was not a request, Judith noted, sitting because there seemed nothing else to do with a command delivered in that particular level voice, that it did not feel like the careless order of a man accustomed to being obeyed. It felt absurdly like being looked after, though she could not have said by what evidence she reached that conclusion, since he said nothing further that might be mistaken for kindness, only stood beside her in the cold garden, holding another woman's mended linens until she had caught her breath. She was aware, in a way she found difficult to examine, of exactly where he stood relative to her, of the particular quality of stillness in him, of a warmth that had nothing to do with the thin autumn sun, and everything to do with being, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, attended to rather than assessed. She told herself, walking home afterward with her empty basket, that an earl's momentary courtesy toward a beggar's daughter meant nothing at all, and found that she did not entirely believe herself. The second assembly of the season fell 3 weeks later, and Judith would not have attended it at all had Mrs. Pruitt not insisted a second time, pointing out with her usual practicality that the companion's position remained open, and that a girl who withdrew from society after a single misstep only confirmed every unkind thing said about her. Judith went, this time in a gown of her own plain-making, having refused to borrow Mrs. Pruitt's silk a second time, and stood for most of the evening near the chaperones, watching the dancing from a comfortable distance, until Lady Ashdown crossed the room toward her with Selina at her elbow, and the particular smile of a woman who had found an opportunity she did not intend to waste. "Miss Wren," Lady Ashdown said, her voice pitched to carry precisely as far as she wished it to carry, and no farther. "How good of you to venture out again. One does admire persistence in a person of your situation, though I confess I wondered whether the beggar's daughter might have thought better of showing her face in this room a second time." The words landed exactly where they were meant to land. Several heads turned. Judith felt the old heat climb her throat and made herself hold Lady Ashdown's gaze rather than drop it. Because she had learned, on cold church steps a lifetime ago, that dropping one's eyes only invited the next blow. She had opened her mouth to reply, though she could not afterward have said what she meant to say, when a voice from just behind Lady Ashdown's shoulder observed, in tones of perfect unhurried civility, that persistence was indeed admirable, and that he had always found it a good deal more admirable than the sort of person who required an audience to insult a woman for the crime of mending her own gown. Lady Ashdown's smile did not entirely leave her face, but something behind it went briefly, unmistakably still. Camden did not linger to enjoy the effect. He asked Judith, with the same level courtesy he had shown her in the garden, whether she cared to take a turn about the room, since the crush near the doors made poor listening for private conversation. And Judith, aware of every eye now watching them both, found herself walking beside him before she had entirely decided to accept. If you have ever been rescued in a way that only made your situation more complicated, you already understand what Judith felt in that moment, half grateful and half afraid of exactly what the room would make of it. And I will tell you honestly that the room made a great deal of it indeed. They spoke, walking, of nothing especially significant: the quality of the orchestra, the early cold, a book of sermons her father had once owned that Camden professed, with what she suspected was genuine curiosity, to have read himself. She found him easier to talk to than she had expected an earl to be, direct where she had braced for condescension, attentive in a way that asked nothing performative of her in return. When he left her at the edge of the room some quarter-hour later, he did not say anything further about Lady Ashdown's remark, and Judith understood, without being told, that this was itself a kind of consideration, a decision not to make her relive the insult by discussing it. She walked home that night turning over, again and again, the particular stillness in his face when he had spoken to his aunt, and told herself, with rather less conviction than before, that it meant nothing at all. Selina Ashdown found Judith 3 days later outside the milliner's shop and delivered, in a low voice meant for Judith's ears alone, the information that Lord Camden's attentions were a courtesy and nothing more, the sort of thing a well-bred gentleman extended to unfortunate persons as a matter of principle, and that Judith would do well to remember precisely what she was before she mistook pity for anything warmer. A girl raised on church steps, Selina said, might learn to mend a hem passably well, but she had not learned, and would never learn, how to be looked at by a man like Camden as anything other than an object of his charity. Judith said nothing in response, because there was, in that moment, nothing useful to say, and walked on with her basket and her burning face, and the old familiar ache of being told, yet again, exactly what size the world had decided she was permitted to be. It was Camden himself who came upon her an hour later, sitting on the low wall outside the churchyard where she had gone to be alone with her thoughts, her father's cracked watch turning over and over in her hands, the way it did when she needed something solid to hold. He did not ask what troubled her. He simply sat beside her, at a proper and correct distance, and after a silence that felt to Judith less awkward than any silence had a right to feel, he told her about his sister. He had not spoken of Anne to anyone outside his own family in 4 years. He told Judith, in the plain, unadorned sentences of a man unused to speaking his own grief aloud, of a sister who had chosen love over rank and been erased for it, of a search that had found nothing but a workhouse register and a name misspelled by a careless clerk, of a niece he had never found and might never find, somewhere in the world, under a name that was not even properly her own. He told her that he had watched, 4 years ago, exactly what happened when a family decided a person's worth could be measured by her circumstances, and that he had promised himself he would never again stand by while a room did the same thing to someone else. That, he said, was why he had crossed the ballroom floor to speak to his aunt on Judith's behalf. Not out of charity. Out of a debt he owed a sister he could no longer repay, and intended, in whatever small ways remained to him, to go on repaying to anyone the world tried to erase in the same manner. Judith found, hearing this, that her throat had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with shame. She had spent 2 years believing herself invisible, a girl the world looked past or looked through, and she understood. Sitting beside a man who had just handed her the most guarded grief he owned, that she had not been looking through him either. Not really. Not since the moment in the garden when he had taken the linens from her arms without being asked. She did not tell him she loved him. She was not yet certain that evening that the word applied to a feeling so new and so frightening. She told him quietly that she was sorry about his sister, and that she understood, better than most, what it cost to be a person. A room had decided not to see, and something in his face, listening to her, softened in a way she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to witness. I will tell you, because you have stayed with Judith this far, that the story does not let her rest easy yet. The room that decided her worth in a single curtsy is not finished deciding, and the coldest part of her winter is still ahead of her. Edmund arrived in Ashcombe on a wet Tuesday in November, ostensibly to visit an old business acquaintance, and called upon Lady Ashdown within a day of his arrival, having heard, through the efficient machinery of provincial gossip, that his cousin's orphaned daughter had somehow attracted the notice of an earl. He had spent the years since defrauding Judith's father comfortably, living on the income of the very estate he had stolen through forged accounts, and he had no intention of allowing a stray, inconvenient reversal of his cousin's fortunes to disturb an arrangement that suited him extremely well. He told Lady Ashdown, over tea taken with the particular relish of a man enjoying his own cleverness, that the girl's father had been a debtor and something worse before his death, a man whose accounts, properly examined, would show irregularities no respectable family would wish attached to an earl's household. It was not, strictly, true. Edmund had learned long ago that a well-placed suggestion, delivered with enough confidence, required no proof at all to do its work, particularly among people already inclined to believe the worst of a beggar's daughter. Lady Ashdown received this information with the particular satisfaction of a woman handed exactly the weapon she had been wanting. She did not act on it immediately. She was, whatever her faults, a strategist, and she understood that a blow landed too early lost half its force. She waited instead for the parish's harvest ball, the largest gathering of the season, the same room in which Judith had first curtsied wrong, and she chose her moment with the precision of long practice. Before that moment arrived, Judith heard the rumor second-hand, from the haberdasher's wife, who had it from a maid, who had it from a footman in Lady Ashdown's employ, that the beggar's daughter's father had died owing money all over the county, and that his daughter had likely inherited his talent for deception, along with his debts. Judith understood, hearing it, exactly what was coming, and understood too that there was nothing she could do to stop it. She had no proof of her father's innocence beyond her own certainty, and certainty, she had learned early and thoroughly, counted for very little against a room already primed to believe the worst. She considered, for one long, cold evening, simply not attending the harvest ball at all. It was Mrs. Pruitt, again, who persuaded her otherwise, not out of any confidence that the evening would go well, but out of the plain conviction that a person who hid from a lie only helped it grow larger, and that Judith's father, whatever else he had lost, had never once run from a room that misjudged him. The harvest ball was, if anything, more crowded than the assembly had been. The whole of Ashcombe's respectable families gathered beneath greenery and candlelight to mark the season's turning, and Lady Ashdown waited until the dancing had paused and a natural hush had settled over the room before she crossed to where Judith stood near the refreshment table and delivered, in a voice built to reach every corner of the assembly, the accusation Edmund had supplied her. She spoke of debts and irregularities, and a father who had died owing half the county, of a daughter who had clearly inherited more from him than his poverty. And she finished, with the particular relish of a woman delivering a killing blow in company, by observing that she, for one, had said from the very first evening that one could always tell what a person truly was, whatever gown she borrowed to disguise it, and that the beggar's daughter had now proven it twice over. The room did what rooms do. It turned to look and murmured, and did not, this time, offer Judith the small mercy of doubt. Judith stood very still, her father's watch a hard, small weight in her closed hand, and felt something in her that had survived every previous humiliation come. At last, dangerously close to breaking, she looked for Camden across the room and did not find him. He had been called away that afternoon to his estate, 2 counties distant, summoned by an urgent matter concerning a tenant dispute, and had left before the rumor reached its full height, and Judith, standing alone in a room that had just called her father a thief, before the whole of Ashcombe, understood in that moment the particular loneliness of being defended once and then abandoned, however unintentionally, to face the second blow by herself. She did not weep in front of them. She would allow herself that later, in the privacy of her own cold room. But in the ballroom itself she simply set down the cup she had been holding, said in a voice that shook only slightly, that her father had been the most honest man she had ever known, and that she would not stay to hear him slandered by people who had never once troubled themselves to learn his name properly, and walked out of the assembly rooms into the cold November night without her cloak, because she could not bear to wait for it to be fetched. She walked the whole distance home alone, and if you have ever carried a grief too large for the room you were standing in, you will understand why she did not once look back. Judith did not leave her rooms for 4 days. Mrs. Pruitt came each morning with bread and quiet company, and did not press her to speak, understanding, in the way of women who had weathered their own long winters, that some wounds needed silence before they could bear conversation. On the 5th morning, a letter arrived, sealed and addressed in a hand Judith did not recognize, and inside it she found not comfort, but confirmation of the worst. A curt note from the haberdasher informing her that, in light of certain concerns raised by respectable customers, her services would no longer be required. She had lost, in the space of 5 days, her reputation, her livelihood, and the one man whose regard had made either loss bearable to contemplate, since Camden had sent no word since his departure. And Judith, in the particular bleak arithmetic of the truly frightened, concluded that his silence answered a question she had been too afraid to ask aloud. A rumor of her father's dishonesty was, after all, precisely the sort of complication a careful man might use as reason enough to let a foolish attachment quietly lapse. She was wrong about this, though she would not learn how wrong for another 8 days. Camden had in fact written to her twice from his estate, letters that never reached her, because Edmund, calling at her lodgings under the pretext of settling his late cousin's affairs, had intercepted them from the landlady with a fabricated claim of family authority, and burned them unread in his own hearth that same evening, unwilling to allow anything that might strengthen Judith's position to survive. He had come to Ashcombe, in truth, for a purpose beyond simple mischief. Reports had reached him, through a clerk he had once bribed and had not entirely trusted to stay bribed, that certain papers concerning her father's original accounts had resurfaced in the files of a Netherfold solicitor who had recently died, and Edmund intended to secure and destroy them before anyone thought to look. He had not reckoned on Mr. Thorne. Thorne had been young Josiah's own solicitor, decades before, and had long harbored private doubts about the accounts that ruined his old friend. Doubts he had never possessed sufficient evidence to voice. The death of Netherfold's retiring solicitor and the subsequent sorting of that man's papers had turned up, among old leases and forgotten correspondence, a set of ledgers in Edmund's own hand, dated years before the fraud, that proved beyond any reasonable dispute that the debt attributed to Josiah Wren had been fabricated entirely, the numbers altered, the signatures forged, the whole ruin engineered by the cousin who now enjoyed its proceeds. Thorne had written at once to the one person in Ashcombe he trusted to act on the discovery with both discretion and speed, a solicitor's clerk of his acquaintance who happened, by the ordinary machinery of a small town's connections, to be in the employ of the Earl of Camden's own estate. Camden received the news on the same morning he received, from his own inquiries into why Judith had not answered his letters, confirmation that Edmund had called repeatedly at her lodgings under false pretenses. He required no further evidence of what had happened to his correspondence. He rode for Ashcombe within the hour, Thorne's ledgers secured in his saddlebag, and arrived on the evening of the parish's final assembly of the season. The same room, lit with the same candles, in which Judith had first curtsied wrong, and had, weeks later, been publicly ruined a second time. Judith had not intended to attend. It was Mrs. Pruitt, once more, who insisted, this time with an urgency Judith did not fully understand until she was already dressed and walking through the assembly room's doors, that some things could only be set right in the same place they had been set wrong. The room fell silent when Camden entered, dust still on his riding coat, and crossed the floor without pause toward the corner where Lady Ashdown stood with Selina, and, unluckily for him, Edmund, who had come that evening to enjoy the last echoes of his cousin's disgrace, and found himself, instead, standing directly in the path of the evidence that would undo him. Mr. Thorne followed a pace behind, a leather folder under his arm, and it was Thorne who spoke first, in the measured voice of a man who had waited 20 years to correct an old wrong, and intended to do it properly. He informed the assembled company, with the particular authority of a solicitor stating fact rather than opinion, that he held in his possession conclusive documentary proof that her father had been the victim of a deliberate and criminal fraud perpetrated by his cousin Edmund, that the debts long attributed to the late Reverend had never existed, and that the estate income Edmund currently enjoyed was, by rights, owed in significant part to his cousin's daughter. The room turned, as it always did, to look. This time it looked at Edmund Wren, whose face had gone the particular gray of a man watching a comfortable fiction collapse in public, and who found, searching the faces around him for support, that none was offered. Lady Ashdown's composure, so carefully maintained through every previous encounter, did not survive this one intact. She looked from Thorne's folder to her nephew's face, to Edmund's stricken silence, and understood, with the swift calculation of a woman who had built her authority on being reliably correct about people, that she had staked her judgment publicly on precisely the wrong side of the truth. Twice, in front of the very society whose good opinion she had spent her life curating. She said nothing. For perhaps the first time in the whole of Ashcombe's memory of her, Lady Constance Ashdown found herself with nothing adequate to say. Camden did not wait for her to recover it. He crossed the remaining distance to where Judith stood, still and pale near the refreshment table, exactly as she had stood on the night of her first humiliation, and he did not deliver, as Judith would later admit she had half feared and half hoped, any lengthy speech. He took her hand instead, in front of the whole assembled company, in front of his aunt and Selina, and a room that had twice decided her worth without troubling to ask her name properly. And he said, his voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to and no farther, that Miss Wren had consented to become his wife. It was not strictly true yet. He had not, in fact, asked her. Judith felt the whole room's attention settle on her like a held breath, and understood that the question, unasked as it technically remained, had somehow already been answered in every way that mattered. Weeks ago, in a garden beneath a bare apple tree, in a churchyard where a man had told her about his sister. She looked up at him, at the particular unguarded hope in a face she had learned, slowly and against all her own caution, to read, and she said simply that she had. The room this time did not murmur unkindly. It exhaled, instead, in the particular collective release of an audience that has watched a story resolve itself correctly. And somewhere near the back a woman Judith did not know began, quietly, to applaud. Edmund was escorted from the assembly rooms within the half-hour, Thorne's ledgers sufficient to ensure the matter would proceed through proper legal channels in the weeks that followed, and Lady Ashdown, whose overreach had cost her considerably more than a single evening's dignity, withdrew from Ashcombe society for the remainder of the season, though she would, in time, write Judith a letter of stiff and awkward apology that Judith chose, with more grace than the older woman had ever shown her, to accept. Selina Ashdown, standing alone at the edge of a room that had just watched her mother's authority collapse, found herself regarded by the company with something closer to pity than triumph, and left the ball early, though not before catching Judith's eye across the floor and offering, to her own evident surprise, a small and genuine nod. The wedding took place at the small stone church where Judith's father had once begged for bread, a detail Camden had insisted upon when Judith, hesitant, suggested it, saying that a story ought to be permitted to finish where it began, and that he could think of no better proof that the room had been wrong than to stand in it, properly, as her husband. By the following spring, they had settled into the Camden estate, a house considerably larger and warmer than any Judith had known since her earliest childhood, and it was there, one evening in April with the windows open to the first mild air of the season, that Judith sat by the fire mending a torn hem with the small silver thimble that had been her mother's, the one possession that had survived every winter of her poverty intact, and looked up to find her husband watching her with the particular stillness she had come to recognize, 4 years on from a churchyard confession, as the look of a man entirely at ease. He asked her, as he did most evenings now, whether her hands were tired. She told him, as she always did, that they were not. Though she let him take the mending from her anyway, because she had learned that his insistence on caring for her in small, unglamorous ways was itself a kind of love letter, better than any poetry. And she had grown to treasure it above every grander word he had ever offered her. Their search for Anne's lost daughter continued quietly in the background of their happiness, a thread neither of them intended to let go. And though the girl had not yet been found, Camden no longer searched for her alone. He had a wife beside him now, who understood better than anyone in England exactly what it meant to be a person the world had once decided not to look for. Outside, the last of the daylight settled gold over the garden, where an apple tree Judith had planted herself. The first spring of her marriage was just beginning to bud. And inside, by the fire, her mother's thimble caught the light and held it, small and steady, the way certain plain, unglamorous things do when everything grand around them has finally, rightly, settled into peace. If Judith's story found you tonight, I hope you carry a little of her steadiness with you. Thank you for staying until the end.